So we're going to get started. Dr. Tao graduated from UC Berkeley with a Bachelor of Science in Bioengineering and a Bachelor's of Art in Molecular and Cell Biology, with a very high GPA, by the way. He was a member of Phi Beta Kappa and Tau Beta Pi, Phi or Pi? Pi, I think, right? And recipient of the Jeffrey A. Winner Memorial Prize, the award given to the top graduating senior in neurobiology with emphasis in molecular and cell biology. Dr. Tao completed his PhD in neuroscience from Harvard University and the Harvard School of Medicine. He is nationally recognized as a premier MCAT mind. He has worked with thousands of undergraduate students as a graduate teaching assistant and MCAT instructor and tutor for Princeton Review. At TPR, Dr. Tao was the only tutor certified in all subjects and was one of the highest rated MCAT tutors to ever was it and a teacher trainer for Princeton Review MCAT division. He has written dozens of MCAT books and guides. Dr. Tao track record for improving students' scores on the MCAT is exceptional. But he's also a very he's also an expert in how to learn science and retain information. So glad that he's able to join us today.
Great. Thank you, Jubin. And of course, thanks everyone for your patience. Going to go ahead and pull up the slide deck, which hopefully you can all see. This is the first of a four-part series I'm going to be giving, and I will say that the next few sessions should go a little bit more smoothly than today. But today's topic is mastering science courses for pre-med and STEM students. All right. So today we're starting focusing more on college courses as a pre-med, right? But where our sessions are going to progress towards is the MCAT exam, right? And that's really where a lot of my background expertise is, right? So as Jubin mentioned, I'm the director of MCAT for MedSchool Coach, right? And I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad. I completed my PhD in neuroscience at Harvard University. And for my MCAT expertise, I've been teaching students and helping students with MCAT for 12 years now. For the first 5 years with the Princeton Review, and for the past 7 years with MedSchool Coach. So really happy to be here, share information that should be hopefully helpful to all of you as pre-medical students. All right, so here's the plan for today. We're going to start off by talking about study techniques for STEM classes, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. And from here, we're going to talk a little bit about preparing for a career in STEM, right? I think it's helpful to think about your classes and how to be successful, but I think often, many times, students think of uh, classes as a means to an end, right? But the way you want to think about education is the purpose of education, for the most part, is to prepare the next generation to enter the workforce, right? So this content that you're learning from your science classes, it's eventually going to be applicable to whichever career you choose to pursue in STEM, right? Of course, this is pre-med CC, so it certainly has a lot of applications within medicine, but some of you down the line may choose to go down a different pre-health track or perhaps try another STEM field altogether. And plan is also to go through the slides and have some time in the end for open Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them and I'll be happy to address them. Okay, so to start, let's talk about mastering study techniques for succeeding in STEM courses. All right. So STEM, I know we tend to throw around this term quite generally, but the courses that you should be thinking about as a pre-medical student are going to be general chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry, biology, physics, right? Those are the main STEM courses that students tend to think about as a pre-med. But these days, there's additional courses that you have to think about, right? You also need psychology. You also need sociology, right? those are the main classes you think of with regard to the MCAT exam, right? But as a pre-med, you're also going to need to take math, right? Which for most students is going to be a year of calculus or perhaps a semester of calculus, a semester of statistics. And calculus isn't tested on the MCAT, right? You really only need to know basic arithmetic. But some of what we're going to be talking about is still going to be helpful for those of you who are preparing for any of these STEM courses you need as a pre-med. So you see the first item here is active learning, right? Something that a lot of students aren't aware about is when you learn material, there's really two ways for you to learn it. There's what is called passive learning and active learning, right? So, what exactly is the difference between passive learning and active learning? Well, passive learning is when you have the information simply fed to you, right? So, an example of this would be right now in this right now in this presentation, I am just telling you information, right? It's similar to when you go to class, your teacher or professor just gives you the information. Another example is if you're reading a textbook or watching a video, right? All of these are forms of passive learning because they're simply presenting the information to you, and your goal is to be a sponge and absorb all of that information, right? Passive learning, as important as it is for learning, it really is not going to lead to succeeding in your STEM classes alone, right? So most students will start with passive learning, but if you want to be successful, active learning is just as important. So how is active learning different from passive learning? Well, as I said, in passive learning, it really is passive. You're sitting there and the information is being presented to you. With active learning, you have to challenge yourself to see how well can you recall the information, right? So a really good example of this is a flashcard, right? So if you have a flashcard and let's say on one side of the flashcard is a keyword such as glycolysis, right? If you see glycolysis, you now have to think in your mind, what exactly is glycolysis, right? And you can see how that is different than passive learning, right? With passive learning, you would just go to YouTube, watch a video on glycolysis, and someone would explain to you what glycolysis is. Now, with active learning, you have to test your own recall of the material, right? And aside from flashcards, you can also do practice problems, right? Complete practice questions. This is also a form of active learning, right? See how well you're able to recall the information and apply the information to the question to answer them, right? So that's the first thing that I think is important to consider, which is if you want to succeed, passive learning is a good start. And that's where most students start. But if you want to be successful, active learning is key. Something I want to add to this too is once you start your college courses, you'll want to think carefully about how you're going to do your active learning, right? In many of your classes, you might have some homework assignments, right? Mastering chemistry, mastering physics, right? These are some examples of online platforms that your professors might assign to you to do active learning. But other times you might have to do a little bit of searching yourself, right? And what I mean by searching is the most useful practice resources are going to be the ones that are most similar to what you're going to see on test day, right? So if you're taking a class with a professor on physics one, it would be very nice if that professor has released midterm exams or final exams from previous semesters of physics one. All right. So if you're completing those previous exams, that's going to be great practice for active learning because that's going to be similar to what you're going to see on your own midterm or final exam in that class. The next item here is concept mapping, right? A challenge for a lot of students is they tend to think of a lot of concepts that you learn as separate and discrete concepts, right? Let's consider, for example, general chemistry, right? Many of you, if you're a freshman or a sophomore, you've probably already taken at least a quarter or a semester of general chemistry, right? And if you think about how you learn general chemistry, you often start with the basics, right? You learn about atomic structure, then electronic structure, then chemical thermodynamics, kinetics, equilibrium, solutions, acid-base chemistry, electrochemistry, and so forth, right? The challenge with learning concepts like this in chemistry is you tend to think of these concepts as separate topics and don't really think about how they're connected together, right? So for many of these concepts, it's important to make sure that you think about how they're related together, right? And concept mapping is a really good way for you to think about this, right? And if we go back to the topics I was talking about in general chemistry, you can think, okay, you learn in your general chemistry lecture in equilibrium about the reaction quotient Q and the equilibrium constant KQ, right? Now you understand those topics, but later when you're looking at solutions chemistry and acid-base chemistry, are you able to connect those different concepts together, right? You know, for example, that the equilibrium constant is the ratio of the concentration of products to reactants at equilibrium. And if you have an equilibrium constant with a large value, that means at equilibrium you have a lot of products. Versus if you have an equilibrium constant with a very small value, that means at equilibrium you have mostly reactants. Can you now apply the same idea to acid-base chemistry or solutions chemistry and realize that, hey, if I've got an acid with a very large value of its equilibrium constant, that means it's a stronger acid versus another acid with a very small value for its equilibrium constant, right? So many of these concepts, try to connect them together. Don't think of them as separate topics, right? And this is not just for general chemistry. You can do this for organic chemistry, for physics, for biology, biochemistry. All of these concepts can be connected together. So whenever possible, I really challenge students to try to think, hey, this concept you're learning right now, how does it relate to previous concepts you learned in that same class? Okay. And the last thing that we can talk about, of course, is uh, study groups. So when you're studying as a pre-med, I really highly recommend that you find a good group of friends that you're able to study with, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea that if you study with people who aren't very good at studying, it's not going to work very well, right? But you also cannot plan on just studying everything by yourself, right? Um, One of the best ways of learning is actually to teach something to other people. The idea being that if you can teach something to other people, you really understand it well, right? So, what do I mean by that? Well, often there's a lot of students who can score very well on exams, right? And that's because they know the science content well enough to answer questions. But if you ask them to explain that concept to you, they might not be able to. And that's because, as I said, if you can explain a concept to someone else, if you can teach it to someone else, that means you have a strong mastery of that idea, right? So study groups can be helpful because you can teach each other, right? There's some concepts that you may understand well, and by teaching it to someone else, you improve your understanding. There's some concepts that you may struggle more with, and then you can have the benefit of being on the other side of having someone else teach you, right? And I will tell you, since I've been teaching students for a very long time, right? Like I've been teaching undergraduate students for about 15 years now. The reason why I still retain a lot of this information on all these classes that I took a long time ago is really because of teaching. So you might think that some of this is trivial, right? Like, oh, I don't need to teach, right? I'll give you an example. Many of the tutors, many of the MCAT tutors that work for MedSchool Coach were pre-medical students like yourself who are now medical students, right? Occasionally I'll get emails from some of our tutors who will say like, hey, Ken, you know, in my rotation today, the professor just was, calling on students, asking them really obscure biochemistry questions. The only reason why I was able to answer the question was because I'm still tutoring students in the MCAT, right? So when you're able to teach information to other people, if that's something you continue to do long term, you can find in the future it can be very beneficial for you. All right. So that's a little bit of an intro, right, on just general study techniques for STEM. I do want to get into more details on time management, right? Time management is incredibly important as a pre-medical student, and that's because you're often going to be juggling a lot of classes, right? But in addition to juggling all of your classes, you also have all of your different extracurricular activities, right? You need clinical experience, research experience, volunteer experience, leadership experience, right? It can be very hard to juggle all of the different responsibilities that you have, right? So if you don't figure out how to manage your time, you're going to run into issues very soon as a pre-medical student. Now, for now, I'm going to focus more on your STEM studies, but realize that many of the strategies I'm going to talk about now for time management, you can use more broadly. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is prioritization matrix, right? So the first thing you might be wondering is what exactly is a prioritization matrix, right? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and draw this out, right? So when you're looking at a prioritization matrix, we can make a little space here in all of you, and we'll then be able to have this later for yourselves, right? So a prioritization matrix pretty much means we're going to have a box, right? And when you're looking at this matrix, there's essentially two different axes that you want to consider, right? So one of the axes is going to be urgency, right? How urgent is this item? So on the right, of course, would be this is something that's very urgent. And on the other side would be this is something that is not very urgent, right? Now, on the other axis, right, in the vertical axis, this is going to be importance, right? So this could be something that is very important versus something that is not important, right? So we're looking at importance versus urgency. And when you have this, this is going to end up with four different quadrants, right? So you can see here, this would be quadrant one, quadrant two, quadrant three, quadrant four. All right. So how can we break this down? Well, again, just think about the two different axes, right? Let's say you have something that is important and it's urgent. Well, that means this is something that's this should be high on your priority, all right? So this is something that you should do now, right? This is important and it is urgent. Now we can think about the next thing, right? Which is, let's say you have something that is you have something that is important, but it is not urgent, right? So if it's important, that means this is something you need to do, but it's not something you need to do now, all right? Well, in that case, this is something that you should plan in your schedule, right? Take a look at your calendar and decide, hey, when am I going to do this, all right? Because this is something you know you want to do, but it's just not something you want to do now. The next thing is, let's say you have something that's urgent, right? So it's very time sensitive, but it's not very important, right? So if it's urgent, but it's not very important, my recommendation usually would be, if you can delegate this to someone else, that would be great. So that way it's not bothering you, right? Because it's not very important, right? Have someone else do it. Or if you can't delegate it, at least try to minimize your time, right? So that way, all right, I know this is something I'm going to do, but instead of spending 3 hours on this, I'm just going to spend 15 minutes on this, right? And the last one, of course, would be something that is not important and it's not urgent, right? So if this is something that's not important, not urgent, honestly, you should just eliminate this from your list of tasks, right? This is just not worth your time, right? It's not important and it's also not urgent, right? So now that we understand a little bit more about how this prioritization matrix works, let's consider some examples, right? What would be something that is do now because it's important and urgent? Well, let's say you've got an exam tomorrow. This would be reviewing the material that's tested on your exam tomorrow. That's definitely something you have to do now. And something you might be doing would be doing practice questions from a past exam in that course, right? That's something you need to do now, right? Now, let's say instead of do now, we're looking at something that you want to schedule, right? This is something that's important. This is not urgent. Well, again, when you're studying for your classes, I know for a lot of students, they have the tendency of just saying, all right, I've got like 16 weeks of class. All right, every day I'm going to go to class and I'm going to go to lecture. I know I'm going to take notes and that's it. Once an exam comes up, they're like, oh, shoot, my exam is coming up soon. I better start reviewing all of my notes. But the thing is, if you wait all of those weeks to review your notes, then that's not great because now you're cramming, right? So something that would be better is at the beginning of your semester, take note. When are all of your midterm and final exams? All right. And let's say you're taking a physics class and your class is 16 weeks and you have two midterm exams and you have a final. All right. So midterm number one is after 8 weeks in the class, right? Midterm number two is 12 weeks into your class. And then your final is, at the end at 16 weeks, right? Well, like I said, you're going to be going to class every week for 8 weeks before you take your first midterm. Don't wait until that seventh week to start reviewing your notes, right? Schedule time every week to review the notes from the previous week, right? So you might say, okay, week one, I went to lecture, I reviewed these notes. The next week, let me add onto my calendar. I'm going to review these notes. And the same thing for the next week, right? Week three, I'm going to schedule time for me to review the notes from lecture one and lecture two from the first 2 weeks, right? These are examples of things that are important, but they're not urgent, right? So you don't need to do them immediately, but you want to schedule them on your calendar to make sure you do them so you can succeed in the class. All right. So, what's an example of something that is urgent but not important, right? So, um, something that you do want to be a little careful about is, as I said earlier, you do want to make sure that you find good friends you can study with, right? You don't want to study by yourself as a pre-med for all of these years, but also at the same time, you need to be careful, right? You don't want to make friends with someone who's always skipping class, right? They never go to class. And when an exam's coming up, they tell you, it's like, hey, the exam's coming up. Can you please teach me this? Right? Because at that point, it's urgent because the exam's coming up. But the thing is, it's honestly not important for you because you need that time to make sure you study well and do well in that class. So if you're spending all this time helping someone else because they skipped all their classes, that's something that you should try to minimize, right? And I'm not saying like, be completely rude and be like, go away, right? Like I said, this is delegate or minimize, right? You can say like, oh, why don't you go to office hours, right? Or why don't you watch the recording of the lectures? Or if it's minimized, you can just be like, oh, sorry, I'm busy studying for my class. I have, like 30 minutes, in this time frame. I can help you a bit, right? That's what you'd want to do. Delegate or minimize these tasks that are urgent but not important. And uh, not urgent, not important. This is anything you can think of that's irrelevant, right? Like I said, if you're studying for a physics class, um, and your professor tells you something like, "Oh yeah, this concept that you learned, there's this really cool paper about this, right? It's not tested on your exam, but if you're interested in this topic, you can read this research paper, right?" That's something that's not urgent and it's not important, right? So if you decide to spend 4 hours of your time reading that research paper because it's of interest to you, perhaps that's not a very good use of your time and you should just eliminate it, right? So I hope this is helpful in understanding the prioritization matrix to figure out how to prioritize your time to make sure you're able to study effectively. Good. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the Pomodoro technique, right? I get questions often from students, right? They're always asking me, hey, how many hours do I need to study a week? And I tell them, well, it kind of depends, right? How much time do you have before your exam? And how far away are you from your target score, right? So this is usually in reference to the MCAT, right? Like let's say a student took a practical exam, they scored a 500 and they want to score a 520, right? That's a really big improvement, right? And I might tell a student, hey, you need to study at least 25, 30 hours per week for the next 3 months if you want to reach your target score, right? Um, Sometimes a student looks at this time and they're like, how am I going to study 25 to 30 hours a week? That sounds like a lot of time, right? And for some students, they might say, okay, 25 to 30 hours per week. Well, I've got 7 days a week. That's 4 hours a week, right? So that sorry, 4 hours per day. So as long as I can study 4 hours a day, Monday through Sunday, I'm going to get to uh, 28 hours per week. That's what Ken said, right? But again, this is something that is easier said than done, right? You might say, all right, um, it's Friday. Friday, I have less classes, right? I only have classes from 9 to 11, right? So I'm going to wake up, I'm going to have breakfast, go to class. After class, I'm going to have a light lunch, and I'm going to spend my whole afternoon from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. studying for the MCAT, right? This is my 4 hour block. But the thing is, then the student sits down, they pull out their textbooks, and they just end up wasting 4 hours, right? It's not easy to, really get yourself to study effectively for 4 hours of time, right? It's just a very extended period, and students often get distracted, right? This is where the Pomodoro technique can be very helpful, which is instead of thinking that you're going to have to study 4 hours in a row, because that's incredibly long, you're essentially going to break up your studies in chunks, right? So something that you might do is just say, hey, you know what? It's not going to be 4 hours in a row. I'm going to study in uh, I'm going to use 30-minute chunks, right? I'm going to set a timer for 25 minutes, right? This is what they would call one Pomodoro, right? I'm going to set this timer for 25 minutes and I'm going to keep studying until that timer runs out, right? Now, I'm studying hard for 25 minutes. After 25 minutes, I'm going to take a 5 minute break, right? I'm going to go watch some YouTube video I like to watch, or I'm going to watch 5 minutes of my favorite TV show, right? Then after that 5 minutes, I'm going to set another 25-minute timer. I'm going to study, completely focus for 25 minutes. And then afterwards, I reward myself with another 5 minutes of my favorite TV show, right? That for students can be a lot more effective than just trying to force yourself to study 4 hours nonstop, right? So the Pomodoro techniques, study in these short intervals and take breaks in between to allow you to maintain focus over a longer period of time. And, these breaks can also be variable. You might say at first it's just 5 minute breaks, but after 2 hours, you might say like, all right, I studied for 2 hours. I'm giving my, a whole 30-minute break or maybe 15-minute break, right? You can play around with it because for everyone else, it's going to be different. What is that time interval you can really stay focused in? But the idea of the Pomodoro technique is it's hard to study nonstop for a long period of time. So if you study with fixed time intervals and give yourself breaks or rewards, it'll be easier for you to study more. Good. All right, and the regular review sessions, I think I already talked about them really as part of scheduling, right? You can't just go to lecture, you need to make sure you're reviewing the information regularly. Good. All right, so now let's focus in on a few more specifics. We're going to look at several of the key subjects that students often struggle in with calculus, chemistry, and physics, right? So calculus, it's one of those subjects that for some students, they get it and they're just like, oh, no problem, it's fine. right? But for other students, calculus is the part of math where it just starts to get very abstract, right? Like, when am I doing all these x's? Why am I doing all of these different derivatives, right? So if you feel like the math makes no sense and if you don't understand there's any reason why you're doing it, I would say it's incredibly important to think about how the calculus that you're doing can be applied in real life scenarios, right? And honestly speaking, if your professor picked a good textbook, your textbook should be full of a bunch of these examples, right? So you realize, oh, when I'm taking the derivative, I'm actually looking at the slope, right? Or if I'm looking at the integral, I'm taking the area under this curve. And this could be applied in different situations. For example, if I'm looking at a heat cycle with an engine, right? If you can better understand the purpose of the purpose of the math that you're doing, it's going to make more sense to you and be less abstract, right? The other thing that I think it's important, and this is really not just for calculus, this really applies to all subjects, which is as much as possible, try to avoid focusing on memorization, right? I know for calculus, I know for a lot of subjects, it can be easy just to like, oh, let me just memorize this theorem. If I just memorize how to derive this theorem, then I can get this question right on the exam. But if you simply focus on uh, memorization, again, that's not going to help you, right? Because you're only going to be able to memorize information for so long. Whereas if you focus on understanding the concept, that understanding is going to persist for a much longer period. It also allows for you to mentally check yourself, right? Like, this is the concept that I'm talking about here. I should be able to understand if what I'm doing actually makes sense, right? And of course, it's without question, you need to do a lot of practice questions, right? Um, there should be more than plenty of practice questions when it comes to calculus, right? Again, all of you are living in this time frame where it's so easy for you to just Google, hey, I want practice questions for substitution, right? Or I want uh, practice questions for, single variable calculus, right? It's very easy for you to find practice questions and complete more practice questions. And that really is important for succeeding in calculus, right? The other thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to mention this in one of the last slides, but I do want to emphasize this because I gave this a similar presentation a year ago, and a year ago I told everyone the importance of using artificial intelligence to study. It's even more important now, right? Because the tools are even better. These days, uh, you can essentially write out your math, right? Like, write out, hey, this is how I'm solving this math problem. You can take a picture of it and you can upload it to any of the common AI systems, right? ChatGPT, Gemini, and such, and ask them, what am I doing wrong, right? And they'll be able to take a look at your work and give you a response, right? So for many of these things, there's amazing tools and resources available to make sure you can succeed in calculus. Good. Now, the next thing is chemistry, right? Chemistry is one of these concepts that can be very, uh, again, make no sense to a lot of people, right? So for chemistry, this is one of the concepts where it's important to start with the basics, to start with the fundamentals. And similar to what I said earlier, look at real world examples, right? If you attend a general chemistry lecture at many universities and colleges, you'll see a lot of live demonstrations, right? A very common one is, professors will have balloons with different gases, and they'll be like, "Oh, this is a balloon with like hydrogen gas or helium gas, or this is a balloon with propane gas," and they're gonna light these balloons on fire, and you can see like balloons exploding into flames, right? Now, it's not without purpose, right? Because many of them um, they're used to demonstrate a concept, for example, stoichiometry, right? Um, this is something that hopefully most of you experienced in your chemistry classes, because without these demonstrations, if all you're learning, if the only way you're learning chemistry is through lecture and textbooks, I can understand why it's difficult to understand. Now, if you have a professor who unfortunately didn't give you a lot of demonstrations, or uh, maybe you missed some of them, you still have other opportunities, right? For all of the science courses, you also have to take them with lab, right? General chemistry with lab, physics with lab, biology with lab, right? All of your lab courses are simply applications of the concepts you learned in lecture, right? So if you really think about your labs not simply as, oh, there's this, 20 steps of procedures that I'm going to follow. If you really think about the labs as applying, real world applications of the chemistry concept you're learning in lecture, it's going to make a lot of sense, right? And I'm not going to deny that there's some cases where, it's not purely understanding. Sometimes you just have to memorize things, right? For the MCAT, you have to memorize what are the six strong acids for the MCAT, right? And what are the seven diatomic elements, right? Like some of those things you just have to memorize, and there are mnemonics you can come up with, right? Uh, for the six strong acids, right? The common mnemonic is, so I brought no clean clothes. Sulfuric acid, hydroiodic acid, hydrobromic acid, hydrochloric acid, perchloric acid, nitric acid, right? So these mnemonics can help you memorize, seemingly abstract information. And just as with calculus, practice is important, right? So always try to do as many practice questions as you can, right? And not just for uh, general chemistry, organic chemistry as well, right? Organic chemistry is one of those where you have to get used to drawing out the structures of organic molecules. Good. All right. So now let's talk about physics. At this point, you're starting to understand the point I've been emphasizing, which is uh, application. Don't think about the physics abstractly, but think about how the physics can be applied. And the nice thing is you start with physics one, which is focusing on kinematics, forces, work and energy, right? All of these concepts are very uh, easy to visualize and understand, right? If you're trying to understand kinetic energy and potential energy, you can understand if I have a rock in my hand, if I let go of the rock, it falls, right? So it's losing potential energy. And you also know as it falls, it's going to speed up. It's going to become faster and faster. So that potential energy is being converted to kinetic energy, right? So trying to have an understanding of the concepts is always better than just trying to memorize equations, right? Don't think of physics as simply plug and chug, right? Like I memorize this equation, I plug in values, I'm going to get the answer. All right. A little bit more about uh, critical thinking and problem solving, right? The reason why I have this here is because, again, I'm starting here by talking about STEM courses, but keep in mind, we're going to be moving from talking about how to succeed in your STEM courses to moving on to preparation for the MCAT exam, right? I often tell students that after you take general chemistry and physics and biology and biochemistry in classes, you have what I consider a textbook understanding of the science content, right? You learn the information that you should from a college level course. But unfortunately, that often isn't enough to solve MCAT problems because the MCAT is not a test of memorization. It's not just like, oh, tell me this concept, tell me that concept, right? You're not just being asked to recall different concepts. You have to apply your knowledge of the science concepts to new situations, new scenarios that you've never learned about before. So the focus is really on problem solving, right? So that is something for you to think about, right? Which is, when you're going through these classes, the reason why it's important not to just memorize is because you don't develop an understanding. And without an understanding, you're not going to be able to solve MCAT problems. And one of the ways you can start to develop these critical thinking skills important in problem solving is to ask questions, right? I know it's very easy to just say like, oh, I'm going to physics. The physics I'm learning is just whatever my professor teaches me, right? So this physics law, it's true just because it's what my professor told me, right? But that's not learning how to think critically, right? When your professor teaches you something, you need to think about that information. Does it make sense or does it not make sense? Right. And if it doesn't make sense, ask questions, challenge that idea. And that's also a really good way of coming up with reasons to go to office hours, right? Establish rapport, establish relationships with your professor. So hopefully they'll write you a letter of recommendation later, right? And you'll have these discussions with your professor, which is going to help you to learn how to think critically about the science content, and that's going to improve your problem learning skills. Okay. And as I said, the science content is important, but it's also important to think about how you can apply this to the real world, right? Eventually into a STEM career, right? So I've been talking about real world applications, and that's just because that's so important when it comes to STEM learning, right? You often hear about careers in STEM because, as I said, you're not just learning uh, random science content, you're learning content that can be applied into a STEM career, right? And again, I know many of you are thinking about this in healthcare, right? But there's other avenues that you could possibly go pursue, right? You can go into industry, you can go to biotech, you can go to pharmaceuticals, right? You could also maybe go into academia, going into research, right? Um, Getting this kind of exposure is important, and this is beyond classroom learning, right? So as a pre-med, one of the best examples of this is research experience, right? When you take your classes, general chemistry with lab, biology with lab, physics with lab, this isn't research experience that you need to be a competitive applicant for medical school, right? You need to find a lab on campus or at a nearby institution that will take you on as an undergraduate researcher, right? When you work in that lab, you're going to start to see how the information you've learned in your science classes can be applied into a lab setting, right? And it doesn't just have to be a research lab. That's probably the most common example, but maybe you do an internship at one of the large biotech companies, right? Or maybe you're getting some physician shadowing experience, right? You're in the hospital, right? Again, many of these are things that you can think about, right? If you take biology, you learn about anatomy and physiology. If you have this patient present with a certain symptom, can you understand the science behind it and see how it can be applied in this situation? Okay. All right. So um, that's a little bit about learning how to apply these concepts, to the classroom because eventually you're looking at a STEM career, right? Um, I don't want to say too much about this because, the focus is a little bit more about classes, but one thing I will say is important is networking, right? Um, it's good for you to take classes, perform well in your classes, but if that's all you do, what you're going to end up with is a nice transcript with a high GPA, right? A transcript and a high GPA often isn't enough to be able to get you a career in STEM, right? You need to get a lot of experiences, right? And when you get experiences, you're going to form connections, right? I'll say for a lot of people, you know, as an undergrad, they might work in a lab, right? And when they graduate, they're looking for a full-time job, right? Sometimes that comes from the connections that you make with people in the lab, right? If you decide like, hey, I really enjoyed working part-time in this lab. I know my lab's not hiring. Do you know any labs there that are? right? And if you did a good job, the PI you work with might say like, oh yeah, there's this lab in this neighboring campus. I know they're hiring. I'd be happy to recommend you, right? So networking is important, and it doesn't just have to be with experiences. Sometimes uh, you go meet people in different ways, right? Go to a conference, go to a pre-health conference, right? And I'll say one other thing too is just reach out to people, right? And I'm going to throw this out right now. Like all of you can go on LinkedIn. You can look up my name, Ken Tao. You can all request me as a connection. I'd be happy to connect with all of you, right? I know a lot of people are intimidated by this, but honestly, most people are happy when someone reaches out to them. And if you reach out and say like, "Hey, I have a question about so and so, can you please give me your advice?" Most people are honestly flattered that you're asking them for advice. And this is a great way to make connections, right? So networking is important, something you certainly want to consider.
Can I
And
can I just add
go ahead.
this one? If you're gonna ask for someone's advice, a professor or somebody else, and if you ask for their advice but you don't listen or don't you're defined about it or something like that, don't expect to go back to them again because that can be really frustrating for some people. So just make sure whoever you're asking that you actually like entrust them and that you will listen to them and follow them because um, they can be frustrating for them and they will be less likely to want to, advise your, give you advice or try to help you out if you just do your own thing.
Absolutely. You definitely want to be tactful about it, right? Because if you're just, bothering someone and you're sending them random questions, or if
Or
you
you
send them a list of 20 questions, that's not great either.
or you're shopping, you're shopping. Um, um, the thing is that some people tend to shop for advice as well. They go from one person to another to get to listen to what they want to hear, and that's also really not a good way. You do want to listen to people that don't affirm your own biases, or you want to hear from people that have different input as well.
Correct. That is something tested on the MCAT. With MCAT, you'll learn that is called confirmation bias, which is not
Yep.
great. All right. Um, Something else that's also important, aside from networking, is make sure you're continuously learning, right? A lot of people think that the only way you learn is through your classroom courses. That's very much not the case, right? As you branch out, as you move beyond college, you're going to find that quite a lot of learning takes place outside of college classes, right? And I'll tell you, it depends on what institution that you go to, but you're going to find that some institutions aren't teaching institutions, right? Like I went to UC Berkeley. It's a fantastic university, but it's a research institution. It's not a teaching institution, right? I had a lecture with a professor who's probably going to get a Nobel Prize, and their lecture was just reading off the slides. Right. So in that case, nobody went to lecture, as even though this professor was extremely famous for their research work. Right. They're there to do research. That's their priority. Teaching, a lot of them don't even want to do. But they have to. They're forced to. Right. But that doesn't mean that, oh, I have a bad professor. That's why I learned this concept wrong. It just means you're not using resources effectively, right? These days, if there's any concept you don't understand, like I said, just go to YouTube and say, and look up, you know, general chemistry lectures, and you can probably find 20 different channels with lectures, and many of them you're going to find brilliant individuals who really care and are good at teaching, right? So there's a lot of individuals who learn that most of their teaching is done, of their learning is done through a YouTube video, less so from their professors. Not saying that all professors are bad, right? Like there's plenty of fantastic professors, but you don't want to say, and I hear this often, a student would just say like, oh, I didn't learn physics too well because I had a bad professor. He just gave everyone an A, right? Like that's not an excuse for poor learning, right? Um, and of course, in research, you're looking at journal articles, right? And um, you're participating in programs like this, right? Where you're attending all of these webinars where people are giving you information you're not learning from college courses, right? There's a lot of these mentorship programs out there for community college students or college students where they're trying to help, provide the mentorship and guidance these students need to succeed.
Summer
All right,
programs too.
absolutely. All right, so I know I've been talking about a lot, right? All of this is really to try to help you succeed in STEM. And as I said before, you know, artificial intelligence is incredibly powerful. Every single one of you should be using AI while you're studying and preparing for your classes. So definitely make sure you're using that. And that is the slides I have for today. And I know there's some questions in the Q&A. I'm happy to start answering them now. But of course, if you have more questions, just go ahead and add them and I'll answer them as they come in. All right. Do you have any tips for studying for organic chemistry, specifically organic chemistry 2? So organic chemistry 2 really builds on organic chemistry 1, right? Organic chemistry 1, you're focusing on a lot of fundamentals, right? It's a little unfortunate because if you struggled with organic chemistry 1, you're probably also going to struggle with organic chemistry 2. It's a little hard for me to give specific advice because it really depends on what exactly you're struggling with, right? So if you give me more specifics on what you're finding challenging, I can give you more details. But as an example, if you're someone who really struggles with stereochemistry, right? Visualizing molecules in 3 dimensions to assign absolute configuration of R versus S, get a model kit, right? If you have a model kit, an organic chemistry model kit, you can probably buy off Amazon for $10, right? Like get one of those model kits, build the molecules so you can rotate the molecules in your hand and be able to visualize them, right? And there's more advice I can give too, but I think if you give me more specifics on what you might be struggling with organic chemistry too, I can give better advice. All right. Next question. I have trouble retaining the information from when I study multiple science classes. Well, that's not uncommon, right? Everyone forgets information, right? And this is uh, what is known as the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, right? I'll probably talk about this in one of our later lessons, but forgetting is natural, right? Don't think that, oh, this weekend I spent 12 hours memorizing the amino acids and the next day I forgot half of them. I must be stupid, right? That's not at all how you should be thinking. That happens to everyone. You review information, you're going to forget information. That simply means, as I said earlier, you need to build in time in your schedule to review the information over and over again, right? Through regular repetition, through regular review, that's how you make sure you're able to retain information for multiple classes over long periods of time. And remember, like I said, many of the classes that I took that I'm still teaching students, I took these classes 12 plus years ago. All right. It's been a long time, but I still know them because I'm constantly reviewing them. Right. So you can do it with constant review. All right. Um, should we ask our physics professor for previous test to study? Has that been successful? I think that's fair to ask, right? I don't think there's necessarily any harm to that, right? Like if you just ask, like, hey, I'm looking for uh, practice exams and practice materials to help prepare for the midterm exam or final exam, you can ask, see what the professor says, right? I'll also say another path is um, often there are student organizations on campuses with repositories of past exams. So if you learn about where these repositories are, that's another way of getting previous exams.
Yeah, I think most some professors would offer it, but there's nothing wrong with asking for it. Also, if you're at a community college, they have them at Mesa centers. Um, but what's the worst thing they could tell you is no, you know, that's um, and don't go in there and say, give me an all. It's like, hey, I just want to make sure I do well on the exam. I'm just little like want to make sure I'm on the right track. Would you be able to have like an old exam that I could take a look at? Some of them, and I know they don't do this at the university. I know they do this at the community college. They give study guides, which I think it's good, but don't get used to it because that's not like a normal thing that they do at the higher levels. So, but yeah, and then also just a Google search, you could find old exams. There's that. What is that website that people post stuff to for classes? I
I
forgot
think
the
there's
name.
several of them.
Yeah, there's several of them that if you Google it, you could find, and some of them are like a little membership fee that you have to pay for, and you could download. I forgot the name of it. If I think of it, I'll.
Sure. All right, next question. Does it have to be calculus or can it be statistics? This varies based on the institution, right? Because there's different requirements you have to consider, right? Which is what are the requirements that you need in order to graduate with your major, right? So sometimes your university is going to require calculus, right? Or sometimes it's flexible. The other requirement you have to look at is medical school, right? So if you're trying to figure out which one it should be, calculus or statistics, the easiest way to figure it out is honestly just go to your university, right? Go to the pre-health advisor, right? And just ask them like, hey, for other students who were pre-med, what did they take? Right. And there should be plenty of students, who have gone down a similar path and they'll say like, oh yeah, the pre-med students, they took one semester calculus, one semester statistics, or maybe a year of calculus. And this is true for the same for the next question, right? So if you're talking about business calculus, I think same thing, go ask other people, right? Like if you're a business major pre-med, I'm sure you're not the only business major who is pre-med, right? So try to find out if you know someone else, right? Like if I take business calculus, is that adequate? And you should be able to get some feedback.
Yeah, I think that part of it too, just you got to make sure that your school for your major, like if you're going from a community college to a 4-year school, make sure whatever looking through assist.org, making sure what that major is because I think I think physics is taught either calculus based or algebra based. And so if you're a biology major, you probably could get away with an algebra, but if you're like chemistry, biochemistry, bioengineering, any of those uh, degrees, you have to have the calculus based one.
Yep. All right. When you ask your questions due to lack of understanding, what if your instructor gets frustrated with you or calls you out for not understanding? Where can you go to better understand or teach yourself material? So part of this sounds a little unfortunate, right? I would say, um, you know, often when a student doesn't learn well, I know a lot of people have the tendency of pointing fingers at the professor and say like, "Oh, it's a bad professor," right? But there's also something to consider, which is it the professor who's bad or is it the student who's bad? Because again, if someone skips all their classes and say like, "Oh, it's a bad professor," it's not really the professor's fault that the student skips classes, right? The first is I would just make sure, am I doing all the things that I need to do to succeed in this class? Right. And this is usually first day of class, right? Like first day of class, when the professor goes over their syllabus, they'll usually tell you, hey, this is what's going to happen with this class. This is what you're going to expect with the chapter readings for your textbooks. These are the practice problems you need to complete. These are the exams that you need to complete, right? And I will tell you, so I've been an adjunct faculty, for multiple years, right? And when I was in adjunct faculty, it was not uncommon that during my first office hour, students would come in and they would ask, like, hey, I really want to make sure I do well in this class. Can you give me some tips or advice on how I can succeed in this class? Right. And I'll just tell them, like, hey, if you want to get an A in this class, this is what you need to do. Right. So the reason why I say that is you want to think for yourself, am I doing all the things I need to be a good student and get a good grade in this class, right? If you're doing that and then you're still not doing well and your professor is being kind of rude to you and not wanting to help you, you might be in that unlucky situation, like I said, which some professors really should not be professors, right? Because they want to do research, they don't want to teach, right? As I said, in those cases, uh, some online resources, Khan Academy, YouTube, find some videos where someone can teach it to you. Um, the other thing that you can do is that most universities these days have some kind of a free student learning center, right? Where they'll offer free study groups for some of the, large classes on campus, or they'll offer some free tutoring or, discounted tutoring, right? So I would also look into some of those resources that may be available to you at your campus. Um, What about dense subjects such as microbiology and memorizing the characteristics of different bacteria? So, if you think that material is dense, wait until you start medical school, right? So, uh, this is kind of the nature of the path that you're going down, right? You're going to be learning a lot of information that's really dense. And anatomy is one of those, right? Neuroanatomy in particular, right? And I say this because, I did get my PhD in neuroscience, and I will tell you that was one of the most painful classes I ever took. Um, the way you have to study for those classes is you need to find something that works well for you, right? I'll tell you, for a lot of students, they like to use um, Anki flashcards, right? And you can look this up online, right? Anki, Anki, right? It's a flashcard system, but it also has a spaced repetition algorithm. And that is what a lot of medical students use to memorize a ton of information, right? Way more than, what you find in microbiology. And if you start to use it now as an undergraduate student, then it might actually end up helping you more when you're in medical school. All right. When you're reviewing lectures and notes, are you using active recall? It depends, right? If you're simply just reading your lecture notes and notes, that's passive, right? Because you're just absorbing the information, right? If instead you're looking at your notes and you're covering up part of the notes, right? You'll be like, oh, uh, you know, here's the part of my notes on the assumptions of Michaelis-Menten kinetics. I know there's four assumptions. I'm going to cover them with my hand and I'm going to test myself. Can I recall what the four assumptions are? That would be active recall, right? So the difference is, are you just reading the information or are you trying to recall the information by yourself? Yep, Quizlet is great as well. Not sure if I understand this point on Brainly.
Brainly is just another
Um,
one of those websites
Got it.
that post stuff. Um, yeah. There's a lot of them. There's also another one. If I look it up, I'll put it in the chat.
Sure. And some of them are probably better than Anki, by the way, right? Because Anki's pretty old and hasn't really changed that much, and there's newer technology, but they're all similar in terms of their function. All right, so the student says, I have taken all of the lower division courses, and I would be transferring the fall, taking MCAT in January. You certainly want to come to my later presentations, and I'm going to talk more about the MCAT, one of them being how to prepare for the MCAT as a community college student or first or second year, undergrad. The first thing I would say is you want to think a little carefully about whether or not taking the MCAT in January makes sense, right? The reason why I say this is because for most students, there's quite a big difference between community college and university, right? There's a lot of students where in community college they've got a great GPA, maybe 3.8 to 4.0. They transfer to a four-year institution, and that fall they get a 3.2 GPA, right? That's a big drop. And it could be for a variety of reasons, right? Like sometimes it's because the courses at a four-year institution are more rigorous than a community college. Other times it's just because it's a lot more competitive, right? You're at a four-year institution, there's a lot more, you know, competitive pre-med students getting those A's. It's harder to beat the curve and get a good grade, right? So I would be a little cautious about transferring to a four-year institution. And in that fall, uh, if you're trying to take the MCAT in January, you'd have to study for the MCAT while taking classes at a four-year institution for the first time, right? I'm not saying that it can't be done, but it's a potential risk, right? That the time that you're spending towards your MCAT may prevent you from maintaining a high GPA, right? So something to consider, right? Maybe don't take the MCAT in January. Wait until you've uh, acclimated to four-year institutions. You've proven to yourself you can still maintain a high GPA and then start studying. With regard to your question, though, of what upper division classes can I take to help on the MCAT, any additional advanced biology classes are good, right? The top of my list are physiology, neurobiology, and endocrinology, right? Those are perhaps the three highest yield topics in biology. Beyond that, any other biology classes are good, right? Genetics, cell biology, immunology, microbiology, right? Anything you can think of, all of that will help you on the MCAT, but don't take the classes if you don't have to, right? Because for most students, when they're preparing for the MCAT, they try to take a lighter course load so they have more time to dedicate to MCAT prep. All right. Is it true that if I graduate with my associate in psychology, it's hard to get into pre-med classes in the university level? I would say no, right? There's nothing about graduating from community college that makes it harder for you to you know register for classes, right? Every university is different in terms of how the registration works. My recommendation is speak to other students on your campus, right? Figure out if there's something that's important about how registration works, right? For example, at a lot of universities, prioritization is based on how many units you've taken and what year you are, right? And that's simply because universities need to make sure students graduate on time. So seniors have the most priority for registering for classes, and then juniors and seniors and sorry, sophomores and freshmen, right? But you can and sometimes registration is in two phases. So it's like you can register for two classes first and you can register for two more later. This is also the reason to speak to other people, find out what are those competitive classes that are hard to register for that you want to register in that first round.
Yeah, the other things you have to be careful too at the university, like if you are in the school of, humanities, you can't take classes in School of Engineering. So there's some of those limitations, or I think you have to do it like through like petitions, but you could absolutely take any classes within your division department. And and yeah, and trying to, but also you have to understand some of those introductory pre-med classes, you're taking them with like 800 people. So they're going to be, there's going to be multiple layers of things. But yeah, you could take any classes you want. There's once you're at the university, they're not, you don't have this, lead scarlet, on you that says you went to community college and you're just a student just like anybody else. So you have every right and privilege that any other student would have.
Absolutely. When studying, should I only focus on key concepts, homework, and notes? Again, great question to ask your professor. Go to
Yep.
office hours and ask them, right? Because they'll be able to tell you, right? And I'll say this, it really depends on each professor, right? Um, Ideally, the everything should align, right? The assigned reading from your textbook the lecture material, your homework assignments, all of it should match. But there's been plenty of cases where it doesn't, right? Like professors that assign readings in chapters. And then if you speak with them, they tell you, oh, if there's stuff that's covered in your reading that's not in my lectures, don't worry about it, right? So ask your professor. That's the best way to get the answer to your question.
I would say one rule of thumb is that if you have, you know, an hour and a half lecture and the professor spends an hour talking about one concept or one problem or one thing, pretty much be sure that's going to be on the exam. But the other part of it too, just some professors will tell you like, hey, focus on what I say in lecture, or hey, I'm going to say stuff on lecture. Go read more from the book, or problem sets. They giving you problem sets. More likely, I would say, make sure you know how to do those problems and that you've tried them. They're not like giving them to you just for funsies. There's a purpose behind it, and so just ask them. Like that's the whole point of office hour is like obviously when you go to office hours, don't do it the day before exam, or don't email them the day before the exam and say, hey, what are you going to be on the exam? They'll be like, but yeah, so just make sure you you talk with them as well. Go for it, Dr. Tao.
All right. So that is the time that we have for today. So I do want to thank all of you for joining us for this presentation. Like I said, it's the first of a four-part series, right? So if I didn't answer your question today, we're going to have three more of these presentations in the next month, right? So come ask questions, and these slides, I'll send them to Jubin, and you're going to be able to have access to them to review them if you want.
All righty. Well, thank you again, Dr. Tao, for coming, and really appreciate you taking the time, and see you again.